So if we dive straight in, Anna, I would love if we could start with what your catalyst was and the moment at which you decided to stop scrolling and start solving for a problem that many of us care about but feel completely overwhelmed by.
For sure, my catalyst, the definitive one, would be the image of Aylan Kurdi. So I remember that I'd already started following and reading and getting more engaged in particularly what was going on in Calais at that time, and also what was happening in Greece. But that image on the front page of every paper was a defining moment for me and for Tamsin, our co-founder, who, you know, we just both we didn't know each other, and for both of us in our lives, it was very much the moment of just, no, this, you know, I can't stand by and just watch this continue to happen, and I need to at least try my best to do something to alleviate it.
And what did that look like?
Now that looks like an organization of 9 of us. So we ended up from that point volunteering in Lesbos, so no kind of previous experience in working in charity sector or humanitarian field, but just like you said, this catalytic moment of being like, I need to change something and I need to do something. And so we used social media to find people working in Greece and in Lesbos, and we worked with them to ask what they needed, and resoundingly they needed medical aid at that point. And so we went out to Greece with a load of medication and 12 doctors and nurses that we managed to coordinate on social media. And yeah, it was horrific for us. It was a really tough experience, what we witnessed, and also to see what people were going through in Europe, and a bit of a realization of what the humanitarian sector looks like on the ground and in a crisis zone in reality, as kind of different to what we perceived it to be.
How was it different?
So I studied in international relations, and while I was studying at uni, it was always kind of this big, one day I want to work for the UN or a big INGO. And looking back, I'm not really sure where that came from. I think it was very much a perceived career move rather than really understanding within myself why I'd want to do that. And then after university, I'd volunteered and then decided to go down a legal pathway instead, as I saw that as a bit more of a practical way of supporting people, but still donated to big charities and, trusted that in times of crisis that they would be there and that they would be responding in a really pragmatic and informed way, and in a way that was, like I studied at university about white savior complex and the effects of short-term aid and planning for the long-term scenarios. And from what I studied at university, then perceived that was kind of token within those organizations, that you couldn't just swan in as maybe people had done previously and put a plaster on something, that you had to engage with the community and fully understand what was happening and where it was going to go and what you could do to help those communities that were affected on a long-term basis. And so when we went to Greece, initially we took all this medication thinking that we would kind of plug into something bigger, plug into this incredible response that people had the resources to create. And we didn't find that at all. So when we arrived in Greece, it was November 2015. And so it had been in the headlines, and we assumed that there would be Save the Children, the UN, UNICEF, people there. And what we found was, we found one woman from the UN who was doing a 3-month needs assessment, as the fatalities daily were, in double figures. And we were seeing 6,000 to 8,000 people arriving, I think, per week at that point. And just no food, no water, no medical aid, nowhere to house people, no one would travel support, no processing, no claims being taken. It was an absolute mess. And so it was horrifying to think that somebody would need to stay there for 3 months before they would be able to access support for people. And then more horrifying was that when, under international pressure from the media, I think, the NGOs did decide to respond. One of the things that was really challenging for me is that we were meeting people fleeing war who had so much in common with us. You know, they'd had careers, they had aspirations to study, they were beauty influencers or bodybuilders, you know, like people from all different types of background. Resoundingly, they just wanted the opportunities that we all have, you know, to live somewhere safe and private, for their children to be able to go to school and to be able to support themselves and not rely on anyone else. And yet when the large NGOs, bar MSF, who were incredible, but when the majority of large NGOs responded, what we saw was they didn't listen to those affected communities, and they didn't really listen to the Greek community either. You know, they went with their status quo of, well, this works in Sierra Leone, or this works in Afghanistan, and this template of, okay, we're going to bring in tents for one, you know, in a freezing winter with snow. We're going to get people to queue up in lines three times a day for meals, and we're going to push people into this forced dependency, and we're going to make people need us, essentially, rather than listen, you know, what is it that you need? And it was really challenging in Greece because the host community really wanted to help so much as well. So the local Greeks were saying, how can we help people get into housing? How can we get people into work if they're going to stay? Or that's kind of since the borders closed. And before that, how can we help people safely move through Europe? You know, how can we help them get to wherever their families are or wherever they're going? And so that was, it was just a real stark contrast and really difficult to take. And it wasn't any individual person either. It was the individual people working for large organizations all had such incredible intentions and were motivated in the same way that we were, by talking to and listening to those arriving, but worked within these structures that didn't allow them to kind of just respond as a human.
So they're completely beholden to the bureaucracy of those organizations.
Absolutely.
No matter how positive their intent, as you said. And how has that situation evolved since?
I think there's been more accountability from the grassroots movement. So I think what we're seeing within migration within a European context for sure is that through social media and through kind of this mobilization of a grassroots movement, that we're holding larger organizations to account more. You know, it's not something that they can pretend they're not doing. They've seen it. Whether that impacts change, I'm not sure, because I think some of those, you know, structures are so bureaucratic and such, they're their own monster, that even within them, people trying to change struggle to move all the parts they need to. So I think it's changed in that there is slightly more accountability, but nowhere near enough.
This is hugely eye-opening, though, because I think a lot of us kind of almost fall into a relation, like a sense of complacency and a dependency on these big organizations that we naturally, as you did before you went to the front lines, assume are doing the right things and have the knowledge and know what they're doing. Yeah. But you experience firsthand that, in fact, they are very poorly organized on the ground, and the consequence of people's lives.
Absolutely. And also, you know, the consequences is people's lives, but also no system change, no structure change. And because it's their knee-jerk reaction is this structure and to check everything, there's a lack of innovation because people are so afraid to take risk and afraid to think outside of the box. And that's the sole reason, you know, that and our incredible clients are the reasons that our organization has been successful, is because we didn't have to go through the UN grant funding route. We were really lucky that we had supporters, and we were funded initially by your everyday person. You know, we crowdfunded on Facebook, and that gave us the movement to do what we needed to with the money. It wasn't beholden to anyone else.
Exactly. Agility and freedom to be able to spend it according to the challenges that you were seeing in real time.
Exactly. And react human to human. You know, at that point we don't work in anything medical now, but at that point we were supporting people's medical needs. And if someone presented themselves with, literally we had a lot of cases where people had trench foot. You know, we had the money to go to a shop and buy en masse walking boots. And we know for sure that those large organizations didn't have that. Oxfam came to us because they couldn't buy, the way their funding was restricted, they weren't able to buy children's glasses. And so a lot of the children on the boats on the way from Izmir to Lesbos or any of the other islands had lost their glasses. And so you had children who are already traumatized, going through this incredible upheaval in their life and now can't see from something so basic as children's glasses. And they contacted us prior to us even being a registered organization. We were at that point a group of volunteers to ask us for €400 to go and buy glasses. And that just shows, I mean, that's one example.
And so a couple years down the line, or a few years down the line, what are some of the biggest challenges from a communications perspective, and how are you addressing them as an organization, and how much is that kind of part of your work? Because as I understand it, most of your focus is really on assimilation here in the UK and helping people rebuild their lives again, rather than being back on the ground in Greece.
Yeah. So we now work in language. So we support people to get their English language to a fluency level, and then beyond that, a qualifying level. So you can get different variations of English language qualifications. And then our other program supports people back to their previous career. So if you are qualified in your home country and you want to return to your career in the UK, you have to re-qualify your qualifications. So you have to get the UK equivalency of whatever it is. And that's across sector. So a plumber, beautician, neurosurgeon, lorry driver, whatever it may be, you have to get the UK equivalency. And it's prohibitively expensive. It costs, the average, so for a lorry driver, it's £6,500.
Far out.
Yeah.
That's staggering.
Mad. For a dentist, it's £8,000. Lawyer is, upwards of £10,000.
And these are folks who have fled their home countries, are coming here with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs.
Yeah, exactly. And even if they had money in their home countries, the currency value will be usually in most war-torn countries so low, and they would have spent whatever they have on getting to safety in most cases. And so you also have that alongside the fact that as a refugee in the UK, you have no access to credit. So no access to an overdraft facility, no access to a credit card, no access to lending. And that's because you have a lack of bank statement history in this country. And also a lot of countries from banks are perceived to be risky. So you get sporadic bank accounts being closed down, etc., which makes it really hard to access capital to cover that cost that you need to return to work, and then forces you to be dependent on benefits. And so our two programs is that we work with language schools throughout the UK. And this was something we found, is that there is an outpouring of goodwill out there. And the reason we started working in the UK is people we'd met in Greece, or people who we'd become aware of through our local community who'd arrived as refugees in the UK, wanted to get back on their feet. So there was 4 people we knew who lived near us. 2 of them were students who disrupted their studies and they'd been forced to flee. And 2 of them were healthcare professionals, so a neurosurgeon and a dentist. And their English was at a point that we could have a broken conversation or use an interpreter, but not definitely at fluency. And resoundingly, they all just, wanted to get back to education or employment. And so we were like, okay, cool. Well, what can we do to help you? Just on a personal level, like how can we help you get there? And particularly with Kareem, who's a neurosurgeon, it was, we were very naive. We were like, oh, the UK is such an amazing place of opportunity. We'll want you to get back to work. We'll want you to get back to university. We value education so highly. I'm sure there will be amazing structures in place to support this. And then we started looking into the ESOL provision of English language. So there was a lot of press around how David Cameron had tried to increase ESOL provision and make it, for good and for bad. And when we looked into it, it was just horrifying. Most of the English language classes that were provided by the government were 4 hours a week. And they were single level lessons in areas. So whether you were a beginner or upper intermediate, you'd be sat in the same lesson, which is impossible to learn. On top of that, 4 hours a week isn't enough for anyone really to learn another language. And so after 6 months, people would become so disheartened with the process that they would end up dropping out. And the mental health impact also was huge of not being able to learn English, and makes everything seem hostile. How do you get your child a place at school if you're unable to communicate? How do you know where the bus is going if you can't ask? How do you, before you're even thinking about renting a house or getting a job, the very basic things. And so we went to our local for-profit private English language school that usually caters for students from quite affluent countries who come over and pay to learn English. And the courses cost between about £250 and £500 a week, which was totally unattainable for, anyone that we were working with. And so we went to the first school, which was Wimbledon School of English, which we didn't know was the number one in the UK. This is an absolute fluke. And we just said to the receptionist, do you do anything to support refugees in the local community? And we've got 4 people who we know who live down the road, basically, who really need some English language help. And she said, wait there 1 minute, and came downstairs with 5 members of their senior staff. And they'd been crying out to help. They'd gone to the British Council and said, what can we do? And they'd said, we'll organise a 2-week trip to Jordan. And they didn't have the resources to do that. And they said, what do you need? And we just said, look, we can cover the travel and the exam fee, which is relatively low, and make sure that that person is supported with their legal support and housing, etc. If you can provide the tuition. And they were like, yeah, go for it. You can have the spaces for as long as you need. So we focus on the language and getting people's language to fluency. And then we focus on getting their qualifications recognized. And now we're working quite closely on finding those employment opportunities for people. And in terms of communication, I think it's been challenging in that we have created, the media and the politicians have created this narrative that someone who flees their home is less intelligent, has less aspirations, and might not, is complacent essentially when they get here, and they're quite happy to not work and drain this economy. And yet we've never met anybody who doesn't want to go back to education or go into employment. And also not only that, but we meet so many people with incredible skills and experience who have so much to bring that we don't have here. The neurosurgeon I mentioned, he was in a situation recently where they were operating on a brain and a piece of technology failed. And I mean, he's had experience working in a war zone where they have no technology, and he knew how to do what the technology did on his own. And so did it, saved a life, and then ended up, showing other doctors how to do that.
Incredible.
It's incredible, and it's also hard to communicate that on a larger level, because you're just faced with quite a hostile environment in which to communicate that. So we've been looking at how we do it by sharing people's stories, because I think that's one thing that's incredibly powerful, is when you're confronted with one person's story. And you can't dispute it, and it's not a statistic, and it's not an opinion. It's their story. So sharing more of that. And then also on the flip side, looking at the stats too, in terms of the finances. And I think it's sad that we're in a position where for some people, that's what we do have to communicate with. And that's what's important to them. And it's not, helping another human being. It's actually, this person is going to pay taxes. That shouldn't, in my opinion, be the argument, but it does help us to communicate with audiences who might otherwise not want to hear or get engaged.
Drawing back to this kind of wider piece around public opinion and narrative and rhetoric, it's hugely depressing to see how xenophobic the rhetoric is here in the UK. I wonder what your thoughts are on how you can begin to change that en masse. You've talked about kind of sharing people's stories. Is part of it also reclaiming the narrative about what we're trying to work toward? How do we begin to paint a better picture of what is possible when we invite people not only into our hearts but into our homes? And think about what that kind of society and future could look like?
I spoke with my grandma recently about her generation. So she was alive during the Second World War, and her generation and her perception of asylum and refugees, and how we've lost that education that we had in that situation. So she remembers in all communities and throughout the media as well, when the UK supported lots of refugees, both after the Second World War and also with the Bosnian conflict too. She said that it was a sense of pride within communities. People were proud to be supporting people and to be helping a fellow human being. And I think we've lost that slightly. I think there's a lack of, and whether it's to do with community and moral obligation, I don't know. But I think we've lost the pride that comes from, supporting somebody, not for anything other than the fact that you want to help another person. I think engaging and having conversations around things that we find challenging is also important. So I think what we need to do more of is give space for people's opinions and finding common threads. So even if your opinion on something that you feel so passionately about is polarized with somebody that you're discussing it with, just finding a way of communicating with them and finding that common ground and working back from that, I think is absolutely key. I think when you're talking with people, what is the common goal within those group and within who you're engaging with, and how do you get there? And understanding that it's always going to be fractured structured in some way. You know, I've had clients of ours who have asylum in the UK, and we also have very different opinions, you know, about how support for people with asylum should be. You know, you might have, your opinion doesn't define the relationship that you have with that person. It's just part of it.
And we were talking about how important it is to have, you know, Christmases where you bring around lots of family members with lots of really diverse opinions.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it is about how to maintain those human relationships and those connections. And ultimately, as you said, how to find that common ground. On a previous podcast, we're talking to Ellie Hansen, this clinical psychologist, on value systems.
Mm-hmm.
And we were looking at why it is that typically conservative-leaning people are kind of steering away from, you know, topics like climate change, even though in many instances they were the original kind of custodians of the land and of nature conservation for different reasons. So it's figuring out what that kind of common language can look like, so that we can, you know, agree on the kind of basics and then find a way to navigate from there. But as you said, it can be a little bit grandiose if you head over to, you know, creating a very detailed kind of vision of what you think the future should look like.
I think some of the reasons that conversations get so polarized is that we struggle to give the space to change our mind. I know with my own family, in heated conversations about things that are really important to us. So climate change, migration, money, everything. It's become difficult for people to change their mind and not feel like they're held accountable to a previous opinion that they might have had. We live in this increased polarized society. You know, technology has become, it's amazing, but it's also become a bit of a beast in terms of, you know, perpetuating your worldview and your opinion and surrounding you technologically with people with the same mindset, that it's really difficult to change your mind and challenging on something. And then also to kind of have that space to say, you know what, I don't know that I 100% agree with that anymore. Brexit was a really good example. You know, it became so hostile that people started to put the way they voted as part of their identity. And that's really challenging. You know, if you've voted a yes or no or a leave or a remain, and that becomes part of your identity, there's no wiggle room there to say, you know, well, I have doubt, because you're kind of identified by that decision. I pride myself on being an open person and wanting to be open, and I think I did ultimately vote Remain, and I think being part of the European Union was a better thing then. However, I'd been in Greece and I'd watched what the EU was capable of, and the negative, you know, children were drowning and we weren't doing anything about it as a union, and actually the EU was making it more hostile. But it wasn't okay for me to have that conversation anywhere. I was on the fence for a long time, but my family had already pigeonholed me in one way, and then the people you work with and the people you socialize with. And I found it really hard to have like a middle of the road conversation with anybody.
I think my generation is responsible for is this like kind of cancel culture. So people being held accountable for things that they said a long time ago and don't necessarily still hold to be true. And it creates this real kind of fear, I think, also of being able to explore that messy middle and explore the gray area and the nuance, which, if anything, is what we need most desperately right now, because it's the only way that we're going to stop polarizing one another. I'd be curious to hear a little more about, you know, social media and your experience, perhaps on a personal level dealing with this challenge, but also in the context of your organization and what you're doing, because I'm very aware that on the one hand, it can be such a positive kind of amplifier for impact. I remember you telling me about, you know, people being able to send one another coordinates to find loved ones, you know, and even the fact that you and your co-founder Tamsin found one another via a Facebook group, which is pretty cool. But then at the same time, these major institutions not being held accountable for the xenophobia and the racism and the horrible bigotry that is flourishing on these platforms, and how they can act as these terrible silos, and also the level of government institution then intervening to be able to carry out prejudice against people based on whether they're immigrants or not.
I think social media has been the greatest gift and the biggest worry for a long time. I like for me personally and for our organization, in terms of like, so Tamsin and I met on a Facebook group, basically when I had that moment of I need to do more. You know, being 25, the thing I did was go on social media and look for what I could do. And I joined a refugee welcome Facebook group that was collecting food and, you know, clothing items and sending them to Syria and Greece. And Tamsin had joined it as well because she lived in the same community as me, but we'd never met. We didn't have, any mutual friends, nothing in common. At that point. And she wrote a post on the day that Aylan was the same age as her youngest. And for her that, she wrote the post saying, I can't just sit back anymore and in our relative privilege and not do anything. And I'd commented, and Luke, who's now a very good friend and also a surgeon, had commented as well saying, should we meet up for a coffee and just have a brainstorm? From that, we found on Facebook, on social media, an amazing woman called Meryl, who was in Lesbos, who's Dutch, we never would have crossed paths with ever without having that platform. And we just dropped her a Facebook message because she'd been blogging and essentially and writing posts about what she was experiencing in Lesbos and had gone out there from the images that she'd seen. And I remember talking to her and she was like, I had no idea what I was turning up to. I'd packed a bikini because I thought, I could go and do some volunteering and help out and then also have some downtime. And she turned up to absolute hell and was getting 3 hours sleep a night. And we messaged her and we said, what do you need? And it was from her that she said, I need this. And not just us, like Help Refugees started from a hashtag, the Worldwide Tribe started from a blog post. It was all through social media and it's created this movement and we're able to know what's happening on the ground. Alongside that, when we were in Greece, my way of dealing with what we were seeing and witnessing there every day was to write about it. And that was my outlet and still is now for dealing with the trauma that we see so much of. And those posts I put on the Facebook page and they ended up generating, a lot of awareness of what was happening on the ground and also a lot of money. It was an amazing fundraising tool and it leveraged money that for sure saved lives, that we saw save lives. And when you're reading an account about a group of people who are on the ground and need medicine or need tents or XYZ, it makes it more comfortable and you're more confident with where your money's going and the impact that it's having. And that's continued. And I think so many organizations and grassroots movements have come from that. And for that, it's amazing. It's also, like you were saying, the communication tool. There's a film called Oxygen that some close friends produced and made. And that was about a text message that a boy sent that saved a lorry full of people's lives. And so it definitely is incredible. And I fear for what, how much worse some situations would be without it. But at the same time, it's also terrifying in that people are sharing such important data and life-changing data and information about themselves on a platform that doesn't really have any security. So the Institute of Migration and the EU were working together on a skills audit. And they wanted to, I really believe from a good intention perspective, wanted to pull together people's employment skills and previous experience onto a database for all of the EU so that they could match up the skills that people had with job opportunities throughout the EU. Which in theory sounds like, a relatively good idea, but then you've got a quantifiable way of saying, well, this person is worth X amount of money because they can work in this job. So what about all the people who are fleeing for their lives, who are young people who have no work experience or are illiterate or don't have access to education from their home countries? Do they not deserve the opportunity to live somewhere safe?
And I think that's really reflective of also what happens when you try to solve a problem from the top down without actually being on the grassroots. As you continue this work, every day you'd be hearing horrifying, really harrowing stories. How do you maintain your emotional resilience and how do you keep on keeping on when you see the scale of the problem and just how enormous it is?
I have a whole new understanding for the strength of human, like the emotional resilience the capability that we do have is astounding and so inspiring. And I have an amazing woman who has had a difficult to believe, incredibly hard life where she has been trafficked 3 times. She's had her eggs harvested. She has children. She has been through absolute hell, lived under IS, lived under governments that have subject her to horrific torture, and yet she is sat in front of you desperately explaining how about extraction of teeth and how much being a dentist is what defines her and how passionate she is about getting back to work as a dentist, but also inspiring other people that they can do the same. It's hard not to come out of that quite positive. One of the things that I struggle with is the policy side. I think I find it really challenging. And so selfishly, for whatever reason, I choose to stay away from that. And we definitely try and support it with kind of case studies and evidence and statistics. We very much focus on people and practical solutions that we can do. So when we went into lending, we wanted the loans resoundingly to be interest free, because for religious reasons, people don't like to borrow money with interest. On top of that, if we'd put interest on it, we'd have been subject to much more regulations than we are now. And we didn't want to make a loan unaffordable. It wasn't why they were doing it. We got laughed out of a lot of funding meetings with kind of big funders or more commercial funders saying, well, you're never going to get your money back lending to refugees, lending to a group of people who fall under a statistic. And it ended up being that one of our largest funders is actually Europe's oldest private bank. And their take on it was, well, this is back to basics banking.
Yeah.
It's relationship building. This is how banking started.
Yeah.
You meet somebody, you get to know them. You basically make a judgment call on their character and whether you think they're good to give you the money back, and then you give them the money.
Brilliant.
And it's so interesting how like tech has made us build this whole system that actually doesn't really necessarily apply,
isn't it?
Yeah.
And it also shows the danger of assumptions,
Yeah.
right? And the people that you're in those meetings with immediately just let their bias like get right in the way. What has the success of that program looked like?
Well, the success of that loan program at the moment, touch wood, is 100% repayments. So we haven't yet. So we've lent £710,000. We haven't yet had anyone default. We've had numerous people, I think over 35 people now in work. So for all of the people that we've lent to, around 85% of those are on benefits or in informal work. And I think that was something that was a huge eye-opener for me, is that I didn't realize the levels of exploitation and slavery that are going on within the UK. And so people are forced into either benefits or kind of very informal, very exploitative work. And so aren't really earning a salary, as it were, or are taking very little money from the government. And the average salary post-loan is at the moment £38,000. So we're seeing people go into complete independence and then be able to help each other. So our alumni, as it were, are now coming back and either donating or mentoring or letting us know, hey, look, there's an employment opportunity come up at this firm I'm working at. Have you got anyone that needs some experience?
It shows the impact of when you take a chance on someone, and when that person has faced extreme adversity, the likes of which many of us here in our privileged bubble have never even touched with, how that can completely revolutionize someone's life. So if we talk a little bit about the kind of relationship between climate and the immigration crisis, could you share a little bit about what is kind of projected in that lens?
Yeah.
Because we've seen the sort of social breakdown that happens from really bad policy in the EU.
Yeah.
It's a problem that's just going to continue to get worse.
It's for sure the thing that keeps me up at night. If you flee your home because of war or persecution, under international law, you have a human right to be protected. If you are forced to flee your home because it's no longer livable due to climate issues, you aren't under any international protection. So no other state has any obligation to support you, which is terrifying.
That is staggering.
Yeah.
It's absolutely staggering.
This isn't something that we're thinking about 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 2 years from now, even 5 weeks from now. This is something that we should have been working on decades ago. And to draft policy and get policy adopted at a UN level is, it's takes a long time, unfortunately. There's different projections, but as of now, there's around 70 million displaced people globally. And the projections for the end of this year, beginning of next year, looking at 150, 200 million people displaced. It's about to get a lot worse, and there's not a lot of noise in terms of like policy on how we make sure that fundamentally there is a legal argument for people to be protected. So one of the things that I was learning about recently is an amazing photographer from the New York Times called Josh Harner, and he'd done some work in China and Inner Mongolia where the the desert has basically, so lands that were grasslands that were farmed for generations as grasslands are now desert due to climate change, and that people displaced from there because they have no way to create food and crops and trade and have any employment opportunities or support themselves. They've then been moved into these camps that have been created by the Chinese government, where their life is sustained, but there is absolutely no opportunity for them, you know, which we know leads to a mental health crisis and resignation syndrome and everything that comes with that. And so, like, what are we doing? How are we working on that? And how are we finding new opportunities and creative and innovative opportunities for people affected by it? And we're not creating any structures. So there is no way of those people moving, let alone accessing opportunities. You know, people can't access finance, as we're seeing. People can't access family reunification. To not be reunified with your family and to be displaced throughout the world, we know we're going to have people who are going to struggle to live everyday life. So yeah, it's painting a very bleak picture, but that is what I worry about most. And, you know, I don't see any nation leading the way in it. I don't see any kind of leaders discussing it on a global level. It's definitely not touched upon in the media.
What is this resignation syndrome?
When there's a complete loss of hope, children go into this comatized state. So they resign from living, essentially. So physically, their organs are functioning, but mentally they have completely resigned from life. And so they're motionless within Greece, within Moria, now that the borders are closed and that these people have really run out of hope. So Moria is a detention facility that was designed to accommodate 2,000 to 4,000 people. And there's currently 18,000 people there, under extreme circumstances with no opportunity. I mean, no opportunity to get out of detention, let alone any opportunity to, you know, have a normal life, what resembles a normal life. And these are people who have been subject to the very worst of, you know, humanity. They've lived under conflict. They've been bombed. They've for sure lost family and friends, like children and adults who have lost that much hope that their bodies just, give out.
How do you maintain your focus and that depth of the focus? Because I feel that, you know, spreading ourselves thin is what keeps so many of us from having greater impact in the world, even with the best intentions. It just means that we can't be very effective because we care about so many different problems. How on a personal level and an organizational level have you really honed in on where you realize that you can have the biggest impact?
So whatever we were going to do, we wanted to do it well. And we wanted to make sure that if we were going to support somebody, we were going to support them right into the point they didn't need us anymore. And I think that's something that was very, very important to Tamsin and I. And so we only work with now individuals who have arrived in the UK seeking asylum and who either previously were in university or previously had a career. And just doing that, I think, and sticking to it.
And what do you guys need right now?
What we need right now is support from employers. The average time it takes for someone to get the level of English language they need to go back into work or education is around a year to 18 months with us. And then to requalify on top of that can take up to 2 years, even longer in dentist case. And so people have overcome that, studying, applying themselves for so long, get fully qualified, and then are going for job interviews, and they're being denied the job based on the fact that they're from a country where people have perceived it to be war-torn and have the perception of somebody there. And that's been really heartbreaking. You know, somebody who has overcome all this adversity to then have this preconception be the challenge that they're facing, and also one that's really hard to overcome. And they've been quite corporate employers. Had people going into commodities, brokerage, trading, PR, one guy, or two people actually, who got through a 3-round interview, and then when the employer asked for their ID documents, sent his BRP, and refugees have all the same rights as a British citizen to work in the UK, sent his refugee permit over, and the offer was retracted.
Joking.
Yeah. Another amazing woman who's been with an employer on a temporary contract, and then somebody within the company said, look, I've heard that basically they're not going to put you on a permanent contract because they don't think clients will bill you because you're a refugee. So we need employers who are looking, who understand that what people have been through is a huge strength to a company. Like, it brings such an incredible perspective that people are really looking for these opportunities and committed to them. Yeah. And that the skills and experience that people have is incredible and surmounts a lot of kind of UK experience. Yeah.
In founding RefuAid, you have so effectively found this piece in this 1,000-piece puzzle of where you can create great impact and where you can really impact individuals' lives. I think all of us want to be able to engage with this challenge and yet have absolutely no idea where to start. What would be your advice to someone who wants to do something, wants to show up according to those, unique skills and talents that we all have to do something meaningful, but don't know what that looks like?
Reaching out and getting involved and making yourself aware. Volunteering literally changed my life. And I think there is a need for support, not necessarily always overseas. You can do that down the road for sure. Being kind to people, I think, is one thing. Like some of the stories that we find really difficult from clients are just someone yelling at them on the bus because they took a while to get their English, across, and they were asking for directions. And even if you're having the worst day, just know that other people are also having their worst day, I think is really key. I think if you're in any situation where you are responsible for recruitment, it is a psychological thing that when it comes to hiring, people feel more confident hiring people who look like themselves, who sound like themselves, and have similar experiences to themselves. And that's because we feel like we can identify with that person and we trust their experience because we've lived it. That's not necessarily what's right for that role. It's just something that might make a hire or a recruiter feel more confident. If you're in any position where you're responsible for that, just checking yourself, well, actually, what would someone different to me bring to this, and how can I do that? Like funding, like grassroots organizations. I think if you are looking to support organizations, just second guessing. I'm not saying that big organizations don't do amazing work. They have a platform that's needed in a lot of scenarios, and I'm sure they do good work. But just, are there movements that you've heard about or have been gaining traction, and looking into them?
There was a story that you were telling me about a group of leaders from an established corporation who were on a kind of quest experience. This group of executives came and met with your team, that's right, and had a conversation. What was the outcome of that?
It was a financial company. And they perceive themselves to be very open and liberal. And I think at a senior management level, really convinced that they were, really proud of how they were supporting people from diverse backgrounds to get back on their feet financially. A handful of our clients joined us for the workshop. And it turned out that each of those, I think it was 3 or 4 people, each of those 4 people had their accounts closed by this financial institution. And so you had in a room like a bit of a facepalm moment of this institution explaining how open and welcome they are. And actually following that, it ended up that the senior management decided, relooked at their lives and reevaluated their purpose and decided that following money and a career projection just wasn't for them anymore, and ended up moving away and going into working in social impact. They were all worked very hard. They've all got to a financial position where they're pretty financially independent. They're in a senior role, and they just didn't feel like within the structure that they were in and within the bureaucracy that they were in, they could really enact the change that they could do outside of it. And that it's quite inspiring.
I've had that conversation with a number of people in these, massive incumbents who are trying to ignite that internal change and trying to push the needle, but they're working in a system that is fundamentally geared against them and geared against that innovation. And so those feelings, those thoughts, the very nature, the corporate kind of DNA suppresses activism, suppresses challenging the status quo. And so increasingly we're seeing more and more professionals deciding to just completely drop it, or at least take all of that professional experience and knowledge and bring it to the social impact, environmental impact space.
Because they can move more and there's more room for maneuver. We are seeing people who have come from a bigger, more diverse range of backgrounds come into the sector with different skills. And it's something that I've definitely enjoyed, is that we never came into this with the mindset of giving anybody a handout, for sure. But a lot of charities do have that mindset. And I think it's been really amazing, particularly social investment and different funding streams and the overlap of profit for good and what non-profit organizations are and B Corps. It's challenging the innovation, and that's really exciting.
It's super eye-opening because, again, it's relating to people you wouldn't otherwise kind of affiliate with. And coming from the kind of not-for-profit space, that has been massive for me, is then engaging with corporates, and sitting down with them and realizing how much positive intention there is, but how many barriers there are in place. And the same kind of self-limiting beliefs that I hear in the classroom working with 11 and 12-year-olds who think I'm too small to make a difference, you also hear in these boardrooms. And it's staggering, but that's it. It's so easy to fall into that state of complacency and I'll do my little bit. But now, as we realize, is the time when we need radicalism. We need people to be transformational. We need people to redesign these systems and have the courage to do so. In your experience, what are some of the ingredients that create the conditions for that courage?
A willingness to test the limits, pushing back. A naivety in some ways, I think, is important. Like when I look around at the people that inspire me who've founded organizations at the same time and grown them to be bigger or work in different spaces, we all started with a sense of naivety of what we would be taking on and where we would be today. The reason that we were able to found the organization is that we were both in a position in our lives where we could. So I was living with family and Tamsin was a stay-at-home mum whose partner financially supported her when we first founded, and we weren't able to draw a salary for the first kind of 18 months to 2 years. And when we were, for sure, it wouldn't have been enough to live independently in London. And so that was only because we were able to rely on family and friends to do that we were able to do it. And that makes me a little bit sad because I worry about, all the creativity and innovation that there must be for young people now who, like, particularly if you're living somewhere like London, you just don't have the opportunity to really invest in. And I've got friends with amazing ideas who have financial commitments that mean they wouldn't be able to walk away from their 9 to 5, but need to really push that and flourish. It would be amazing to see more support for those ideas from people who just need that kind of support.
I have a number of friends who, have started small organizations and initiatives while they're doing their 9 to 5 and increasingly creating more and more space and time for that, and to the point where they can make more of that transition.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, what would you say to Anna, pre-September 2015 before you launched into this incredible journey?
Like, stick to your gut. I think it definitely, as a young woman coming into a sector, particularly when we've worked in the finance space and the charity sector space, to be fair, but particularly in finance, people were very quick to give you their opinions. So not listening too much. Opinions are important. Advice to be taken lightly would be what I'd say.
Yeah. I feel that absolutely. You just need to be like crazy enough to just go out and test it and try it and fail for yourself and potentially come to those conclusions yourself.
Yeah.
But at least you'll learn in that process.
And I think the other thing is find someone who just gets it and speaks your language. Like, there's no way I'd be here without Tamsin. And it's because we get it just completely, without even talking.
That's it.
Know the page that we're on, and it gives you that confidence within each other that you've always kind of got each other's back, but you also, like, it's like a supporter, you're supporting each other with decisions that you make. And it's also a soundboard. I think we've got a relationship where we're not afraid of checking each other and disagreeing, and that's really important as well.
Yeah, building that tribe that just gets it, exactly as you said. So you mentioned, obviously, personal relationships where you might have friends, family members who disagree with what you're doing or who didn't support you. Mm-hmm. In those moments where I imagine there was so much doubt in your mind because you were taking such a radical leap, what kept you going and what kind of instilled the motivation to kind of set aside the naysayers and just, not compromise?
It was just thinking about what we'd seen in Greece. There was a guy that I met who was a teacher, and he just the most passionate teacher I have ever met. And he had decided, in a situation with like no hope and where we didn't have anything, to create his own education program for the children that were there. And so on his own, with no support from anyone else, he started teaching these kids and put in like a routine. And in like the most absurd situation, they'd been relocated to tents in an old petting farm. It was like really mad, and he just seen that as an opportunity. And he's been through such a difficult journey, but he's somebody that I really went through that with, and I saw, and I used to leave and get on a plane and come back to my family and friends, and he would still be there, and so I always just think of him, and I don't know where he is now. And there's a lot of people like that who we've met who we didn't stay in contact with, and just thinking like, what you can do to help that person that you don't know really keeps me going. And then also just surrounding yourself with some people who really do believe in you. So like a good friend or somebody who you're not afraid to tell that you really fucked up. Like that you can go and say, I made a massive mistake. I've done it. You screw up a meeting with people who are very business minded and want business statistics, and you've just gone in with a story about somebody and they rip you to pieces verbally. I think it's okay but you just need those people that you can be like that with, and cry and scream and ring at 3 a.m. That's what keeps me going.
And a number of young people that we've surveyed feel that they have the experience, they have the knowledge, they definitely have the passion and conviction about the challenges they want to take on. But they don't feel like they have the support, whether that's in their family, whether that's in their social group or from their teachers, and are really lacking confidence and desperately need that kind of validation of ideas and safe space to be able to talk about these challenges in a really open way and also kind of overcome that fear of failure.
Yeah.
Because that's what keeps so many of us kind of like rooted to the ground. And it's reflective of the education system, right? It's not okay to screw up.
Yeah.
You know, it's you're graded on being a set of averages.
Perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's it. And you're kind of like pegged against your teammates. You're pegged against your friends and your peers. So what has helped in those situations where you feel, oh, damn, I've royally messed up? How have you kind of navigated that?
One thing that I found really helpful is having somebody who inspires you, who's at the end of a phone or the end of an email when you come up with those stumbling blocks, or when you're making a big decision that you're like, I think this is right and my gut's telling me it's right, but I just maybe want someone else to tell me that it's not really bad. And the other thing is like having people who've failed around, like to talk to too, and who've failed and are doing okay, or failed and are doing something even better than what they failed at, and I think that's been really helpful, is like not being worried, just not being afraid to mess up, and knowing that other people have messed up before you and also gone on to do great things.
That's it. Back yourself and have the confidence to do so, because especially in your case, you have firsthand experience of the problem. You've gone to the source, you've had those conversations. It's very easy to dole out advice when you haven't actually experienced something. And
to overcomplicate it. A lot of the like offers of support we got as a startup, which there's so much of and it's so hard to navigate, was like consultancies about strategy and like brainstorming sessions with people who have absolutely no idea what you do every day, and offers of like advisors who've never been, in this situation but quite fancy being on a charity board. I think it's really hard sometimes to say no as a startup, because you think you should be saying yes to everything, but just taking it all with a pinch of salt and actually drowning out the noise sometimes. And we learned to say no to stuff, and that's been really valuable because it's actually just been given us the space to concentrate.
You just come from the perspective of like asking a bunch of questions,
and
doing so, mess up, and something I love that you've said is like do so with a lot of humility. Be super open.
And people will help.
Yes.
That's the other thing. I think one thing that I was really scared of that Tamsin was a lot more confident with was the FCA regulations when we started lending. Like, really, can like 2 women from Surrey just start lending money and not go to prison? But we just found that actually, if you need specific help, if you come up with it, you can ask for it. There are amazing legal firms who'll do pro bono support. When you know what your problem is. I think it's when you don't really have a defined problem and people are ready to give you advice, or a problem you don't yet have, is when when the difficulties start. Not pretending that you know everything either. I think it's something, I think it's quite a strength to not know some stuff and to admit there's all a learning curve. And we're okay because we can just be like, well, we've never done this before, so we don't know, and just keep that going.
My final question for you, Anna, is what do you want your legacy to be, and how can the people listening to this help you achieve that?
It would be, we are all just the same, and that if you want to help another person, it's as simple as asking what they need, and then if you truly want to help them, listening and seeing if you can provide what they need, and if they can't, helping them find where they can get that help. We all have different beliefs and experiences and values along the way, but we do have the wonderful power to listen and talk to each other, and just simplifying what we've created to be this aid sector and this charity sector. It's not a sector, it's not a career, it's just a person helping another person, and we all have the capability to do it. Which is so beautifully embodied by you and Tamsin and your incredible team. Hugely inspired, very motivated. Thank you so much. You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me on.